one that I've personally been very excited for because we have a personal man, myth, legend, my high school U.S. history teacher, high school UIL coach, and so much more, Mr. Zach. He's been a teacher for over 26 years and is frankly one of the most insightful people I know and has been one of the most instrumental people in my personal life. So I know he'll have a lot of great information to share, not only just about teaching, but he's got a wide plethora of knowledge about a lot of different careers he did before then. And I'm very excited to pop into this. So first off, thank you, Mr. Zach, for taking the time out of your day in the middle of this craziness to be here.
Well, if you'd have been this complimentary in high school, you'd have made straight A's for me all the way through. So just wanted to get that out of the way. But thank you very much for the over the top introduction.
Well, so just to start right off, I mean, can you just walk us through your career path and, especially because you come from Wisconsin, right?
Yep.
All the way down to Texas, maybe how that transition happened, how you got into education?
Sure. Yeah, I was in college and floundering. Didn't really know what I wanted to do after high school, and actually started my path into radio about 3 years into college. That took me out of college. I actually dropped out of college as a junior. Traveled around a little bit, did some radio, ended up in Northeast Texas, and after a failed attempt to get a Democrat Richard Anderson elected into a state Senate job, actually reelected to a state Senate job in must have been 1990 maybe. Decided that, okay, the combination of radio and being a press secretary in politics was nice. It was adventuresome. I was younger and but it had no stability to it for me, honestly. And so when I started sitting back and thinking about what parts of my personal characteristics were suited for what kind of job. So thinking about things like being outgoing, well, there's some radio stuff to that, and having some knowledge about what's going on in the world because I was a news director for a radio station, being involved in politics with Senator Anderson at the time. Those things started ticking off the boxes that really pushed me towards social studies teacher in a high school class. I liked that age group of kids. I thought they were challenging, and I thought I had something to offer for them. So I went back to school and started the path towards finishing up my degree, which, when you walk away 10 years earlier and then try to get back, it's a different challenge. But by the time I think it was 28 when I finally walked out of college and had my degree and got into the classroom.
So, I mean, what was it like when you originally dropped out of college? Like, how did you get your first radio job? Were you freelancing? Like, were you just driving around looking for people who wanted to hear a charismatic voice like you speak about sports? How did that start?
No, I actually went to almost like a tech training program that was a 16-week program. And at the end of that, the guy who actually ran that sort of helped you figure out how to find jobs. And so my first job was as an overnight babysitter, basically, for an old radio system that it was easy listening, and all the music was on reels. So I just changed reels overnight. But now you have on your resume, I have a job in radio, and that job in radio, you got to cut the weather in the morning and maybe do a news break, and that led to the next job with a little bit more responsibility, and that led to the next one. And it's literally is starting at the ground floor, changing reel to reels to get into radio.
And so what was the main decision? So you mentioned that high school kids, kind of where you thought you'd be able to interact with them the best. Was there ever any thought about middle school, elementary, anything like that? Or did you
Never.
Never, not at all?
Never. So for me being a teacher, part of that had to be the intellectually challenging part of dealing with the people that you're dealing with. And it's not to say that 12-year-olds can't be intellectually challenging, but to be honest with you, it just wasn't for me going to be stimulating enough intellectually to keep me involved in wanting to do that.
And so what was it like getting so you graduate with a degree and you're in Texarkana, East Texas, I assume.
Yes.
And do you start at Pleasant Grove right away? Like, how did you start doing that job search? What did that look like?
Yeah, no, I student taught at Pleasant Grove High School in Texarkana. And when my student teaching semester ended, I was actually a fall student teacher. So I student taught that fall. The spring after I had finished my student teaching, one of the teachers got a job in a different school district. So I had been in the building. I knew the department chair. I had been, familiar with administration. And when that job opened up, they called me and said, "Okay, we have a job opening. Do
Right.
you want a job here?" And so it actually was a fairy tale transition for me. You worked here, student teacher, did fine, liked the department liked you, job opened up, you have a job.
So, what is that student teacher process like? Because I know from knowing you and being in your classroom, you've always had some mixed feelings towards the student teacher process. What was it like for you individually? Were you, having to write your own lessons plans, working in coordination with the teacher? Was it kind of like a free for all a little bit?
Yes, and all of the above.
It's all the
Uh,
above.
the teacher that I actually worked with was a football and golf coach. And
Mhm.
so I started in September, I guess. He was in the classroom with me for a week. He said, make sure you learn the kids' names, hand me the roster. I sat for a week. He did his thing for a week. At the end of the first week, he said, okay, well, football season starts now. Our actual games start next week. So
Uh,
I'm going to be in the field house and I'm going to be watching film and I'm going to be doing that stuff. And the classroom's yours. And if you need anything, you just call down to the field house and let me know. And then I'll come back up and help you. So I got my feet, not just wet, but thrown into the deep end a week after having
uh,
started student teaching. And now it's really a matter of trial by fire. What are you going to do in front of 25 kids with no other adult in the room? And you've basically sat down and learned their names and you know nothing else.
uh,
Uh, and for me, while it was a little bit scary at the very beginning, it was an amazing opportunity because I went from basically Labor Day to Thanksgiving by myself in that room
right.
and didn't have a whole lot of interaction with the mentor teacher. He'd show up every once in a while. He made sure grades were done and all that. But when Thanksgiving break came, I basically was told, okay, well, you've done your time, you've done your 16 weeks,
Mhm.
and he's going to come back and take over the class for the last 3 or 4 weeks before the semester's over. And you asked me at the very beginning. I have mixed emotions about student teaching right now.
Right.
And maybe because the way I learned it was full submersion, it was
Right.
all you. The way we do it now, student teachers have a minimum requirement of they have to do 2 weeks. And
Mhm.
after that, they don't have to do any more. And a lot of them don't want to do anymore because it is scary. It is time consuming. You're not getting paid for it if you're a student teacher. You're doing it as part of your educational process. And so to convince them, no, I tell you what, you really need to do 8 weeks of this or 10 weeks of this if you really think you're going to be ready. But you're sitting in the room most of the time and they only do it for 2 weeks. And then it's over. And I really feel sometimes that we turn out teachers that aren't prepared to have full control in the classroom because the way the system is right now, they don't have to have full control in the classroom. And I think it's a disservice for them. Not that they should be done the way it was done to me, like see you in 12 weeks or 16
Right.
weeks, but I think they don't have near enough time in the classroom before they actually are given the keys and say, it's yours to drive on your own completely next year.
I mean, that's pretty crazy. Like only the requirement is only 2 weeks. So do they just get a preset lesson usually that they have to teach for 2 weeks and then
No, they do their own.
they do their own lesson?
Yes. Yep.
So what is that, process like? Because obviously you have, not necessarily different levels of classes, but different things you're having to teach for state standards versus an AP class. It's going to have to go a lot more in depth. So when you're doing your first, state standards, do you just kind of follow what you've been given a little bit, or is there stuff that everyone kind of knows this is what you do at this time? What does that look like?
Well, I mean, with history, obviously, it's pretty chronological, and so if you're jumping in at a certain point in time, okay, well, I'm getting World War I this week, or I'm getting the Depression. I mean, you kind of have an idea by virtue of the structure. You asked
Mhm.
about state standards. Well, within those time periods are the state standards you're going to be required or expected to make sure that the kids know at the end of that
Right.
lesson. With
Uh-huh.
AP classes, you're right, it's a little bit different. It's a little more free form, certainly still following the same chronological stuff, but without having to worry necessarily about, well, I really hit, Woodrow Wilson. Well, I
Yeah.
may not like Woodrow Wilson, and I may decide I'm going to do something a little bit more in depth, or I may have primary source documents that are going to give a little different viewpoint. You have a lot more latitude in an AP class than you do with a standard regular U.S. history class that has to worry about an EOC at the end. Then the AP kids have to worry about not only an EOC but an AP test. You live through that, but
Right.
they just have to know a little bit more about how to analyze and not just regurgitate.
So then what did, the rep, so you get hired back for the spring, and
Sure.
what does it look like after that? Because I assume then you're just teaching you at like social studies, like how did it become, eventually become a department head? What did that path look like for you?
Well, I got the job. I taught world geography, so I had all freshmen, and I taught it for a year or two, I guess. And at the end of the 2 years, the department chair that I worked for took a job at a college here in Texarkana, and
Mhm.
now that position's open. And the other people that were in the department, basically when they said, okay, well, we need to figure out who's going to be the department chair. It's like you stand up in the military and they ask for a volunteer and three people all step backward and you're the one that's standing there going, oh, I
No one
guess
wants
it's
to do
me.
that. Uh-huh.
And so 2 years into being in the classroom, the other teachers I taught with all stepped back a step and said, you're the one that should do it. And so 2 years in, I'm department chair at Pleasant Grove High School.
And so what were your role as department chair?
Well, now you're responsible for, make sure that you have a budget that's maintained for a department, making sure that anything that's professional development your teachers are on top of, conveying information in both directions, concerns that teachers have to administration and issues that administration has that flow back downstream to the teachers,
Uh,
attending department chair meetings. You have a lot more voice as a department chair, I think, than you do just as a classroom teacher. I've, like I said, 26 years into this, and I've been a department chair for 24 of those 26 years. So to have a voice a lot has been, it's exhausting sometimes, it's frustrating sometimes, but you also get a sense that you have a pretty big responsibility to be able to convey to the people up above you what the people below you tend to be thinking and are concerned with and what they need.
mhm. So when did you decide, or is there kind of a path for teachers to follow? You teach this curriculum for a little bit and you kind of move up to the DC, the dual credit AP classes, or was that your personal decision of, I want to get this special certification to do that? Because it
No,
requires you having to go to school more, right, as well?
no, I actually didn't. I don't teach dual credit. And if you did teach dual credit, you did have to get, a master's degree and you had to have 18 hours, et cetera. Teaching AP, you don't have any of those extra requirements. And I don't, I'm not going to contradict you, but I don't like to say going up. I don't think, and I think that's maybe a misconception that, oh, only the good teachers teach AP or DC
Right.
and the bad teachers teach regular classes. I
Mhm.
don't, I think you find the the group that you are best in tune with.
Right.
This year coming up, I think I'm going to have 4 or 5 regular sections and one AP section.
Uh,
Sometimes it's a matter of who signs up for what. Sometimes it's a matter of what your preference is. I've asked before to move back to a geography because I felt like that was something I wanted to go back to ninth graders for. So I hate to think that teachers are perceived as though, oh, the good ones are teaching these
mhm.
accelerated classes and the not good ones are teaching regular classes, because
Right.
that's really not necessarily true at all.
Yeah, sorry if I misspoke there. I just kind of wondered what that process, how do you decide maybe that you wanted to move on or
Yeah,
do?
no, and sometimes they come and ask you. I mean, if there's a class that opens up, like if I retired tomorrow, somebody in administration is going to go to the other people in the department. I have 18 people in my department, and are going to go to one of them and say, okay, those classes have opened. Who's interested in potentially
Right.
teaching those classes?
Mhm. So what do you think is the thing about, like, everyone's familiar with teachers, everyone's familiar with teaching, pretty much everyone at some level has had some form of schooling. But what do you think the thing is about teachers that people don't realize, the aspect about your job that people don't realize is the most important?
The most important. Well, this is probably a couple of answers then. I think people don't necessarily see how much time is spent away from school working. I think a lot of people have a resentment toward teachers thinking you only teach 8 or not 8, excuse me, 9 or 10 months of the year, and you have these long summer vacation. And what are you complaining about? You're working 10 months and everybody else is working 12, et cetera. And I get that, but I also know that in 26 years, my days never ended at 4 o'clock. It never started at 8 and ended at 4.
Mhm.
Um, Normally, and this isn't a pity party, but normally to do the job from 8 to 4, you spend a lot of time from I'll go to probably 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 o'clock when I may start my second part of the day, and that'll usually go till midnight, just
Right.
about every single day. So it's a matter sometimes of it's grading, it's a matter of being preparing the next lesson, the quiz, a test, grading tests, whatever it may be. Um, those things happen when nobody actually sees it. That's the stuff that's happening when you're at home and you're like, okay, well, it's 11:30 now. I still have 5 more of these, essays to grade. How many of these can I get through before I finally have enough? I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing that people have a misconception about, yeah, uh, and we talked about student teachers and the lack of actual time in the classroom. I know this from having watched a bunch of student teachers and having been one and now having been a teacher for a long time, that we don't, I think, on the outside understand the preparation to actually walk into the classroom. And I don't mean the day-to-day thing. I mean the fact that you think you've got the piece of paper that says, I've got a degree in history and now I can go in the classroom and teach. Those two things are not related at all.
Right.
Having content knowledge is great,
Uh-huh.
but if you don't understand how kids work, if you don't understand um, that a large part of your day, a large part of your time in front of other human beings is dealing with them as other human beings, not
Mhm.
as somebody that has to absorb a bunch of facts that you know that you expect them to know.
Right.
If it's kids who have issues at home, if it's kids who have health issues, if it's kids who have some stress because of things that are going on in another class or your class or their best friend or their girlfriend, or you really don't, you're almost, and you started this question or ended it with what's the most important thing about this job, and I really think it's being human. I
Mhm.
think it's understanding the psychology of other people, um, that and you're an outgoing kid, Jay. You were, very personable. You had a great understanding of your role in the school, but in the same class that you're sitting in, there may be 5 kids who have no role.
Right.
They don't know who they are. They don't want to be seen. They don't want to be called on. They
Mhm.
don't really necessarily want to be at school. They're sad, they're angry, they're confused. We could go through the whole litany of things that people experience, and yet teacher standing in front of the room wants that kid to be focused on me,
Right.
listen to me, regurgitate back to me what you just learned. And sometimes you got to take time to be human. I
Mhm.
think it's a real big thing that you were at my door with me all the time, shaking kids' hands when they walk in my room, the guys in particular, regular classroom. I want those young men to know that's the expectation. Now we're in a COVID world and we may never shake hands again,
Right.
but
Maybe
that,
I'll do a fist
yeah,
bump.
that's right. But that human greeting, just touching the kids and shaking their hands and conveying, I'm glad you're here. Glad you're here today. You doing okay? Before they ever set foot in your room, gives them a sense that at least somebody talked to them and
Right.
at least somebody asked them how they're doing, and they're not just a name, a number or a name that's sitting in the room someplace and the teacher couldn't tell you who they were from Adam. I
Right.
think that's the most important part.
Right. And you bring up something, a good point that I kind of wanted to touch on, but I think this is something that obviously a lot of people don't realize, but a lot of teachers, they're not probably teaching this in your intro, history learning classes for you when you're getting your degree. This is something that did you have to learn just from experience, or how are you kind of, how did you start to understand the psychology that you had to do and how you would kind of individually approach your way with students?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and they don't teach it, and I don't know that it can be taught. Honestly, I think it's an innate sense that you have. You either can read people or you can't. You either care about people or you don't. I mean,
Right.
you went through 12 years of public education before you went to college. If I asked you, did all your teachers care about you? You'd probably, I would hope you would say yes, but the reality is you probably would say no.
Right.
Did and again, you're an unfair example because probably they cared more about you than they did the other kids. And again, it's because of who you projected to be, how important you were, how outgoing you were. Think
Mhm.
about the kid that's sitting in that same classroom that has none of the qualities that you had. How much did the teacher care about them?
Right. So then, obviously now it's hard to talk about what day to day looks like because we don't know what the day to
Right.
day is. And last semester was an unprecedented situation for everybody involved, and especially for schools. And this fall is probably going to be, a hybrid version of what we just experienced. But pre-pandemic era, what did your day to day look like? I mean, you talked about how it's a lot more than an 8 to 5 or an 8 to 4. What does that? You wake up, you have your Mr. Zach cup of coffee, your Green Bay Packers cup. What goes on from there in the regular day in the life of you?
Well, y- uh,
Or is it so hard to condense it into just one day? Because no day is the same, really.
no, it's not, and I don't know. I mean, you're right. No day is the same, so I hate to say, oh, it looks like this every day. I kind of define for you. I've got a second job. I do a radio job too.
Right.
So I leave school around 4:30. I go and do a radio program, and then I go home from there. I walk three dogs that I have. I go home and have dinner. I sit down for a while and just do nothing, watch TV and get some mindless, so I'm not thinking for a while. And then finally, I said around 8 o'clock, and probably, if I'm honest, it's probably more like 9 o'clock. I actually head into the office where I'm sitting in my house, and I start the process of going through what was the stuff I'm responsible for the rest of tomorrow. That
Right.
I've got to make sure I grade, that I've got to make sure I'm prepared for. So, I mean, that's a typical day, I guess.
Yeah. So, what is usually the relationship like between, because Texas High, the school that Mr. Zach teaches at, is a big school. There's a lot of faculty, there's a lot of teachers. How is it like working with administration? What is that process usually like? Is there, you know, we obviously have tons of different assistant principals. Do you have one specific one you report to? Is it more of a panel you report to? What does that look like?
Yeah, no, we have a social studies assistant principal. So there'll be somebody who will be involved in and responsible for usually a couple things. They may be social studies and English. Another one will probably be science and math.
Mhm.
Somebody will be Kate. So I guess in the chain of command, um, I would report to, or our department would report to that assistant principal, who would then, report to the principal of the campus.
How much have you seen education change in your 26 years? I mean, obviously, history specifically, most of what's happened is somewhat set in stone, but how have you seen the teaching process change and how we approach teaching?
At technology.
Right.
We could just stop with that, right? When I first started, I don't know that there may have been a computer in the classroom when I student taught. It was only for attendance,
Mhm.
and maybe, I guess, maybe for submission of grades.
Yeah.
But that was it. None of the kids had access to technology. There were no cell phones. And I know that sounds like, well, you must have been teaching in the 1800s. It was like 1995. Nobody still really had a cell phone, not as a
For younger
common.
viewers, it was basically the 1800s.
Yeah, right. That's true. But technology is the biggest change. You are now competing with that all the time. Kid has it in his possession all the time.
Mhm.
It's more entertaining than their math class, than their English class, than their history class all the time. But it also is instant access to anything in the world, which is just the crazy. I've had this conversation before. Growing up, buying a set of encyclopedias was a big deal because you gave your kids some chance at having knowledge that you couldn't provide for them. Well, now you've never see an encyclopedia again because it's on your phone. So technology is the biggest thing, but it also then changes not just how, and I think merging in the beginning of this question about the world today, that what's about to happen is about to be a reset on how we can better use technology. We
Right.
figured out in the last 6 months, 3 months, you don't have to go to the office to do your job sometimes. You can do
Mhm.
your job from home. My son's an engineer. He can do his job from home several days a week, if not more. My son-in-law to be is a banker. He can do a lot of his work from home. We're finding out we can do a lot of stuff from home because those jobs have adequate access online to
Right.
financial things, to CAD programs, to whatever it is. They have them. What about education? And it's funny, we're doing a survey this week for parents whose kids are getting ready to go back to school in the fall. And those are the questions we're asking. Does your child have a laptop, a desktop, a cell phone, or whatever? Does your child or your family have access to the internet through Wi-Fi or Ethernet? You were trying to gauge, and you mentioned Texas High is it's an urban school district. So
Right.
we're trying to gauge with a population that's probably 50% living at a free and reduced lunch capability, how many of those kids have their own devices, how many of their parents have the ability to provide for them internet access, and if they don't, how much is the school going to be responsible for trying to get those kinds of pieces of technology into those students' hands so
Right.
that we can move forward? You know, it's the one thing until 20 years ago that hadn't changed in 180 years.
Yeah.
Education was education. Here's the book, here's the desk, here's the teacher, here's the
Mhm.
chalkboard, go. Well, now all of a sudden, phones are available, computers, Chromebooks are available. Now we're to the first place where we may not be able to accommodate kids in the schoolhouse anymore. How
Mhm.
do we tailor our lessons even more so they're individualized, so they're available online, so they're legitimate, so they're not just a times suck, so they're not just a busy worksheet. How
Mhm.
do you actually make something that's a relevant, important lesson that kids are engaged with when they're not sitting in front of you and you can monitor if they're actually doing the work?
Right. And I can, speaking just from the college perspective, they've been releasing our schedules that everyone works really hard to register for because it's obviously competitive trying to get in certain classes you want. And now on a daily basis, you expect that when you log onto your, look at your schedule, something might have changed, you might have moved online. They're shuffling classes to earlier in the day, later in the day to try to fit people. And I feel like those problems are really just magnified at the high school level where, there's a kind of an expectation of, in the past you'll have 8 hours at the school, whatever, 8 to 4ish, something like that. And now you have to try to figure out people who don't have computers. Do you Zoom with them for their class? How do you send them assignments, make sure they're getting it? People that don't learn online well, it can be a lot more difficult at that level. I think it's crazy, especially considering in what March of this year, schools were given like 3 to 4 weeks to just come up with what their plan was going to be.
Well, I'll give you this. In talking to the folks that I've talked to this week, um, one young lady's taken a dual credit English class her senior year and asked about at home, at school. She said, I won't pass that class if I don't go to school.
Right.
I need the teacher to be able to help me learn what I need to learn. It's not my strong suit, but I'm in this DC English class that I'm paying for. So you've
Mhm.
got that. I know personally, we went to doing lessons through Google Hangout for my AP kids because they all had access to the internet. So we did
Right.
class every other day doing that exact thing. I created all my quiz assignments in Canvas. You guys probably use it at the college a lot, but we've never used it at the high school level. So all of a sudden, here's a 25-year, 26-year teacher who's now being thrown into, okay, you need to do Google Hangouts. I've never done that before. You need to
No.
figure out a way to provide quizzes that can be, that nobody's cheating on them. There's a time frame on them. There's a clock on them. You got to be able to, all of those things have all of a sudden been thrown into the lap of a, mid 50s-year-old guy who's been teaching
Right.
for 25 years, and now I have to learn to change my method of being able to present and assess in front of a bunch of kids who may or may not have access to that same technology.
So I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I have two pertinent questions that I want to ask. And the first one
Sure.
is, skill set wise, what do you think is the most important skill for a teacher to have? Because from, people probably think if you want to be a math teacher, you have to be an expert in math, but do you think it goes way beyond any expertise in your subject and it's those interpersonal skills and that approach that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I think you've got to have there's a fine line between being empathetic and being strict about deadlines and requirements.
Right.
You want to be understanding,
Mhm.
but you can't be taken advantage of. I mean,
Uh-huh.
that's therein lies the line of, do I believe what a kid's telling me? Oh my gosh, my grandmother was in the hospital last night and we were there all night long, and I didn't have time to get ready for this thing today and I'm really stressed out. Do you take a step back and say, I get it? Or is that the 18th grandparent who's been in the hospital in the last month
Right.
and you obviously know you're being taken advantage of and played?
Uh-huh.
So I think you want kids to understand this isn't life or death with their math class or their history class, but you also need to understand that high school is about learning how to complete a task.
Mhm.
That's what education is. When you're in kindergarten, you learn how to tie your shoes.
Right.
You check off that task has been completed. You can go to first grade. When you go to first grade, you learn how to add single digit numbers. When you check that off, you go to second grade.
Uh-huh.
Well, everything that we do is putting in front of you more and more and more, hopefully, challenging tasks that you complete, so that when students go to college, they can look at deans can look at your transcript and go, oh, you completed these tasks very well, 98%. You're very good at completing tasks. We'll
Mhm.
go to college, we'll give you more tasks to complete. And ultimately, when you walk out with that piece of paper, some employer is going to say, wow, look at how good you were at completing tasks. Because guess what I'm going to ask you to do?
Complete.
I'm going to ask you to complete a bunch of tasks. And I can see that you're good at completing tasks. So the kid that doesn't complete tasks, down the road, you look at an employer and say, you failed every class, kid. You don't complete a task.
Right.
How am I going to trust you to be able to do anything when I give it to you? So I mean, you want to be empathetic, but you got to actually make sure the kids understand what you're helping them do is hopefully become employed down the road.
Right. So now this is kind of the final question that we really like to ask, and it's taking your personal experience and your 26 years of sage wisdom through teaching and all the life experiences you've had as well. If you could look back on your 18-year-old self or just be talking to an 18-year-old, what would be the token line of advice you would give them? Not just about maybe teaching, but about just pursuing a career as a whole.
You're not going to know what you want to do.
Right.
I figured that, and it's funny because you mentioned to me, but I see it all the time with juniors and seniors in high school that are very stressed out because the choice about college is staring them in the face and they don't know. The choice about they're asked constantly, what do you want to do? What are you going to be? What they don't know. And there's so much pressure on you. You have to make that decision at 17 or 18 years old
Mhm.
that, I mentioned to you from the minute I graduated high school until I became a teacher, I was a tool and die worker. I worked in a factory.
Right.
I worked in a pharmacy. I worked on a golf course. I what else did I do? I worked in radio.
Mhm.
I sold insurance.
Very
Uh,
good.
I worked in politics. I just was at 7 jobs I think I've gotten to before I actually got into the classroom and decided that was the thing that I wanted to do.
Mhm.
So, if I'm talking to my 18-year-old self again, I would say the same thing I tell a lot of these kids: don't stress about any of this stuff, any of these decisions, because I dropped out at 20 and you have time to go back and fix it. If
Right.
that's not what I was on a path towards a business major, and I
Mhm.
didn't want to be a business major. My family had all been involved in owning a company. I was supposed to be the next in line to do that. And the more I got into it, the more I hated it. And it wasn't me. And so I stopped and I did some other stuff for a few years. And when I was ready, I went back and I decided I'm ready now to make the life decision. It's going to be a longer term thing. And
Right.
and that would be the thing. I'm so scared about, I've had kids who were in my classroom who were students of mine who've taken their own lives. Stress is a huge thing on teenagers. And we just pile onto it with the constant barrage of where you're going to go and what you're going to do as if it's the be all end all at 18 years old, and it's not.
Right. I mean, I think that's really the best way to set it. And what's crazy about your point, which I think is a great point, is that having younger siblings, they're having to even start making decisions in the middle school level, the ninth grade level, which blows my mind because remember being a sophomore and then choosing like what our high school degree plan kind of looked like.
Yep.
And now they expect seventh and eighth graders to start making that decision, and it's just going to continually be getting younger and younger, probably.
It's actually fifth grade. The question about which math class you're taking in fifth grade is the one that takes you on the path of you're going to be in accelerated math or you're going to be in basically slower paced regular math classes. And math is, as much as I love teaching history, the ability to master teaching math opens up so many more career pathways. And if you've taken that path in fifth grade of I'm regular math and it's just a slower process, you really have slammed doors in fifth grade.
Well, that's even more mind blowing, to be
Yeah,
frank.
I know, right?
a little terrifying at the same time. But again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day. Obviously, I know you guys are coming up with what your plan's going to be in the next 6 weeks to figure out what school's going to look like. So, we appreciate you and just teachers in general who work so hard to, deal with whatever this craziness is that we have going on right now and stuff. And personally, thank you again for all that you've done for me and fellow students at Texas High and Pleasant Grove.
You bet. It's my pleasure. It's good talking to you again.
Good talking to you as well. Thank you to all our viewers and stuff. We'll have more and more awesome episodes coming up. Stay tuned.